Welcome to this week's Rights in Russia English interview. Today is June 22nd, 2022, and our guest today is Professor Robert van Voren, Chief Executive of Human Rights and Mental Health in the Federation Global Initiative on Psychiatry and a Sovietologist by education. He is currently Professor of Soviet and Post-Soviet Studies at the Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas, Lithuania, and the Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. He's also Executive Director of the Andrei Sakharov Research Center for Democratic Development in Lithuania. Robert van Voren has written extensively on Soviet issues, and in particular, issues related to mental health and human rights. His most recent books include On Dissidents and Madness, published in 2009, Cold War in Psychiatry, published 2010, and Undigested Past, the Holocaust in Lithuania, in 2011. Thank you so much for joining us on Rights in Russia today, Robert.
Welcome. You're most welcome.
We have about 30 minutes for our conversation, so if you're ready, let's get started. You and Russia, the Soviet Union, go back a long way. So how did your interest in the country begin?
I think the one who was guilty is my father, who from a very early age onwards, he was very interested in everything that was related to the Second World War and to Nazi camps. And so even when I was a kid of 6, 7, 8 years old, I was all the time looking at these books and photographs and stuff like that. And then in 2014, he bought Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. And as usual, he finished the book and then gave it to me and said, you have to read. And so I actually read all 3 volumes. And for me, that was kind of a, I don't know, slap in the face. It was something so extraordinary that I decided that I wanted to read more. And so I read a lot by Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, etc., etc. And then in 77, I started corresponding with Vladimir Bukovsky, who first came to the Netherlands and then moved to Britain because he refused to learn Dutch. And so I sent him a letter with 44 questions about what happened to, all kinds of places of detention. And for some reason he answered. And we started to correspond. And I went to his place for the first time on August the 25th, 1978. I still remember the date because it was 10 years invasion into Czechoslovakia. And so I went to his place. He was then living at 60 Chokvam Road in London. And we immediately were pushed into the car because he had to go to Trafalgar Square to give a speech to this big demonstration there. Mm-hmm. And so we became friends, and he basically took me under his wings and he introduced me to the whole field of, dissents and human rights movement, introduced me to Peter Redaway. And basically from then onwards, it was, it's, you jump onto some kind of roller coaster. And the roller coaster brought me to the Soviet Union, and I met people that were arrested fairly soon after I met them, like Mart Niklus, the Estonian dissident who got 15 years. And, from then onwards, it was all like automatic. I had no choice. I had to do this work. And so now I'm there 45 years later.
Well, presently, among your several roles, you're executive director of the Andrei Sakharov Research Center for Democratic Development in Vilnius, as we said. In May 2022 was the closing month of a year of events to mark the Sakharov centennial, since he was born in May 1921. Could you tell us something about how the centennial events went?
Yeah, we just closed the centennial here in Lithuania last week. And in a way, it was, we did a lot of things. We had 4 conferences, we had 5 exhibitions, 4 concerts. We had several poster campaigns in the cities. But it's a very strange, period, because initially, because of COVID, we decided to move the centennial from only 2021 to May 21 till May 22. not knowing that the end of the centennial would wind up right in the middle of the invasion and the full-scale war in Ukraine. And so the last part of the campaign was, apart from a Sakharov conference and concert and a exhibition on samizdat, was a campaign in Vilnius and Kaunas with posters, I am no Sakharov, but, and then we chose 5 Lithuanian influencers who finished the sentence, like, I am no Sakharov, but I am against homophobia, or I am no Sakharov, but I stand for my human rights. And that happened right in the middle of the war. And so we decided to change the coloring of the posters. It became yellow-blue, so the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And we added one sentence, human rights are now more important than ever before. And actually it was very good because, one of the influencers that participated was Vytautas Landsbergis, the president of the Lithuanian parliament when Lithuania declared itself or re-established independence in 1990. And I think the importance is that we showed that, Sakharov, who was Russian, but a citizen of the Soviet Union, he would have been the first one to immediately go out and call this war a criminal war and would have spoken out whatever the consequences would be. And so it's also showing there are also other types of Russians. They're not all these bastards that are, trying to kill whoever they come across in Ukraine, that are, kind of a gang of locusts stealing whatever they can find. There are also Russians that are normal thinking and they know that this is criminal. And I think this image is very important. Because all the time what we are trying to do here is to explain to the younger generation that yes, Lithuanian is free, but it will only remain free if you are investing and that you're ready to defend it. Because becoming free takes a lot of effort. Losing freedom is very quick and much easier, actually. And so we need to keep the young generation mobilized.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that you have young people participating in these events?
Oh, yes. I never wanted to teach. Actually, when I studied in Amsterdam in the late 1970s, beginning of the 80s, I on purpose didn't get a diploma to teach because I was afraid that if I would be without a job, the government would force me to become a teacher of history. And I was a very bad student in school. I teased my teachers endlessly, and I never wanted to be on the other side. And so it's a coincidence that I became a professor. It's thanks to I think one of the big minds here in Lithuania, Leonidas Donskis, who unfortunately died 6 years ago. He was a philosopher, political activist, writer, journalist, everything at the same time. And he told me, listen, come to my university. We need people like you. And I thought, well, let's try. And I love it because you feel that you're working with young people. You're stimulating them, you're making them think, you're activating them. And so I have a pretty big group of young people around me now that are actually socially very active and that are supporting and participating in the conferences and the exhibitions and everything. I love it. It's amazing.
Well, that's terrific. You personally knew Andrei Sakharov, and I'm wondering, how do you remember him? I mean, what was he like?
I met him twice. The first time is I went to his house, I think it was beginning of 1988, because we were organizing the Sakharov conferences in Amsterdam in his defense. And as he came out, it must have been 1987. And so I had to ask his permission whether we could continue this series of Sakharov conferences. And the funny thing is, well, Andrei Dmitrievich was very down to earth, absolutely not having any kind of megalomaniac idea about himself, importance about himself, very down to earth, a real scientist, bad speaker, very difficult in what he was writing. But so we were sitting in the kitchen and there were lots of people talking, etc., etc. And I was explaining to him what we were doing. And at a certain moment, I thought, gee, I mean, something is happening behind me, because he was all the time watching behind me. And I turned around and there was some film about gorillas on television, which he found very interesting. And the second time was 3 days before he died, which was, there was a meeting at the Academy of Sciences in Moscow. And I went there with a friend of mine. We made photos, and he was really very gray and fragile. And you could see that he was really, exhausted. And so when 3 days later, suddenly the news came that he died, it was, it was a complete shock, but also not a surprise. And I remember that night in Moscow, so we were going from one dissident flat to the other. Nobody was sleeping. And in the meantime, snow was kind of coming down. And it was this very weird kind of atmosphere that you understood that this was a moment that you would remember for the rest of your life, and really a turning point. And also something that should not have happened, because, he, like Havel, like Mandela, would have been able to have a real impact on the further development, a moral beacon. And I think this is something that, the region really misses, this type of people. They don't have moral beacons. They don't have any Havels, Mandelas, or Sakharovs. And, we see the consequences today.
Mm-hmm. And what is Sakharov's relevance for human rights today, in particular in Russia, but also globally? I mean, does he have relevance now?
Oh yes, I think, for me, Andrei Sakharov is a person who is, notwithstanding his stature as a scientist and being, Nobel Prize laureate, etc., etc., he was never afraid to tell the truth. Wherever he was, he took the consequences of what he did. He knew that he had his responsibility. And of course, he paid for it, but he was a truly free man. And I think he's a fantastic example to all of us. And sure. I mean, this is something, I described him in his flat. There is this wonderful photograph of him after he came back from Gorky. And he's standing in the kitchen together with Yelena Georgievna. And he is, dressed up in the shirt, which is hanging out of his pants. And he has this sweater on, which is kind of, slightly falling apart. And all this exterior thing was for him totally unimportant, right? You have a lot of these Russian opposition leaders who are very well dressed, and they like luxury around, and they find themselves very important. Sakharov was totally the opposite. He didn't care 1 minute about what he looked like and whether he would be flying business class or first class, or whether he had a nice car or, a Dacia or God knows what. Totally, totally unimportant for him. And I think for me, he's a prime example, someone that I always look up to and think, yeah, this is the way I should be living, and, how we should be thinking about things.
Mm-hmm. Turning now to the current situation, what do you see as the main reasons for Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine?
I think the main reason is a process that started already in the late 1970s, which is the merger of criminal Soviet Union or criminal Russia with politics. It started like the development of these criminal gangs, which all needed to have a Krisha, and it was someone from either the MVD or from the KGB who was kind of protecting them. And as we now know, Andropov very well understood that the country was not going to survive. And so they started the process of trying to ship their property, their wealth to the West. And this is the moment when gradually this criminality and politics becomes one and the same. And I think Putin is a result of this. It's it's a criminal gang which took over a country, very closely related, of course, to the KGB. In a way, the KGB was the strong arm of the party. Now the KGB is the party. And for them, money is the first thing they care about, wealth, endless wealth. And then this is combined with this endless, imperial thought that somehow Russia is not able to lose. But they are not the only ones. I mean, if you look at the French, they also still have this kind of imperial idea that, we can send the Légion étrangère to Africa and we can solve the problems over there. But they don't have a criminal government. This is a criminal gang in charge. And I always remember, Vladimir Bukovsky was kind of my, definitely at the first years, my kind of spiritual godfather. He was my father figure. And he always told me that, he was very often invited to the United States, never to the CIA, because his position was close down the CIA and start all over again because it's a hopeless organization. But he was very often at the Pentagon, and he always told them that, listen, you are stupid. You're talking to the Soviets with diplomatic terms. They don't understand what you're talking about. You need to talk to them as if you're talking to the Chicago Mafia. That's the way it works. And I think the same is happening right now. You need to talk to a mafia. They're mafia. They only understand very strong positions. And so I believe that if at the end of last year, when the Americans clearly knew that Russia was going to do this, and they would have told Russia that, listen, one Russian soldier crosses the border, Ukraine will be NATO, I'm sure that Putin would have stopped. But the process of understanding the situation in the West is a very slow one. And in a way, my fear is now there is this kind of brief period of sanity after the war starts. And now you see it's already kind of sinking that, yes, but maybe, and like Macron saying, Zelensky really needs to negotiate with Putin. Do you think that de Gaulle had to go and negotiate with Hitler? Of course not. So why do you ask Zelensky to negotiate with Putin? I don't see a difference. And this is, I'm really scared about this because I still think the West doesn't really understand the danger of what is happening right now.
Mm-hmm. At the end of last year, the Russian authorities closed down the two main memorial organizations that Sakharov was closely associated with. Could you say a little more about the human rights situation and the state of civil society within Russia today?
I have the feeling that the situation now is in a way worse than under Brezhnev, because in Brezhnev period, and then a little bit less in Andropov Chernenko, there were boundaries. So of course there was telephone justice, and when persons were put on trial, it was already clear from the start what the sentence would be. But they went through the whole process, like the Nazis were administrating everything very carefully. And there were limitations, like the maximum sentence that a person would get was, a recidivist for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, 15 years, 10 plus 5. Unless they would put treason on you, then it could be the death sentence, which they did with Edi Kuznetsov, but then they commuted it into, 15 years. Now there is no limitation. And I think there is a kind of combination now of back to the Stalinist period, in particular to activists on Crimea, 20 years, 22 years, 23 years, absolutely amazing lengths of sentences, or like Dmitriev giving him a sentence which everybody understands is a death sentence. And at the same time, there is something what I call a Latin Americanization, whereby outright torture, beating up people, throwing them from balconies, poisoning, all this stuff is normality. And it never was in the Brezhnev period. This is the time of the special operations of the NKVD, when they sent out people to the West to blow up people and abduct them and kill them. And it's scary. They have no boundaries. And you see what is happening in Ukraine. There is no boundaries. All the limitations that in a normal kind of rule of law would exist, they don't care, because it's a mafia. They act like a mafia. And this is really scary.
For sure. So to what extent do developments like these mean that Andrei Sakharov's aspirations for a country-based human rights have failed to be realized? And I mean, do you think he was simply too optimistic?
He wasn't too optimistic. In a way, he was naive, you could say, because the document that he was working on when he died was a new constitution for a kind of refurbished Soviet Union. Andrei Sakharov was a citizen of the Soviet Union. I mean, this is always my argument when the Ukrainians say, why should we have anything to do with Sakharov? He's Russian. No, he was not Russian. He didn't consider himself Russian. He considered himself Soviet. And for him, there was no difference being Russian or Ukrainian or Estonian or Georgian. They were citizens of his country. Probably the disintegration of the Soviet Union would have been perceived by him as a loss. Although I think he would have been realistic enough to understand that, this is a process that is inevitable. I think he would be completely disgusted by what is happening now. And I think he probably would already have been either pushed off a balcony or poisoned or whatever by this regime, because they don't need people like Andrei Sakharov, right? For them, a lot of the people in the opposition are acceptable because they never will have the status that Sakharov had. Even people like Khodorkovsky or Kasparov, you cannot compare them to Sakharov. Totally different type of people. Navalny the same. And so Sakharov would have been a mortal danger to this regime.
Right. So one of the reasons for his stature was that he was a scientist. And at that time, scientists were revered. Is there no other type of citizen now that has that kind of stature that scientists used to have in the Soviet Union?
It's not. I think the importance of Sakharov was, and this is, it's the combination of time. The Soviet Union was then a closed country, and Sakharov was, at the highest level and able and willing to say whatever he thought. And so for the regime, I mean, they didn't even understand how to deal with him. It's like when Solzhenitsyn published Gulag Archipelago, there is this protocol of a meeting of the Politburo, and there are several people like Podgorny who say, well, send him to the Gulag, give him 12 years or 15 years or whatever. And it's a person like Andropov who says, no, let's send him to the West, because then nobody will, he will be forgotten. So they had no idea how to deal with these people. Sakharov's importance, I think, is in particular at the time when there is this Congress of People's Deputies, and it's broadcasted live in Moscow, everywhere. And I remember, you go to a shop, gastronome or whatever, and there's this television and people are standing there and watching this session.
Mhm.
And they saw that this fragile scientist, bad speaker, the anti-politician, you could say, was the only one who told the truth. And he had a following, an enormous following, because he exposed them. And I think now he probably would have been exposing them as well, and very clearly pointing out that we are talking about a criminal regime. And so that's why I think they would have probably put away with him already a long time ago.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't see any opposition person that would ever at this stage be able to take his place. I think we will need to wait for a new generation. But I think, unfortunately, the only way this can end is with a not only fall of the Putin regime, but the disintegration of Russia. I see no other way, because even if Putin falls, the next one will be just as much criminal as the current one. It's like the Hitler regime. It really needs to go to the very end. And that's my concern, because the West doesn't understand that.
Mhm. So, speaking of the West, thinking about the Western media and their coverage of the internal human rights situation in Russia, how do you think that? What do you think about that coverage? And what would you recommend to someone in the West who wants to learn about human rights in Russia today?
Well, the coverage is slightly haphazard. I could say. I would say they're very much focusing on specific individuals like Navalny, like Khodorkovsky,
Mhm.
um, and there is what I notice, especially, but also here in Lithuania, is that the number of people that watch Russia and have this aha erlebnis, you could say, that recognize everything from Soviet times, there are very few left. Most of them have either retired or passed away. And so this younger generation has to start from scratch, to start to learn to understand the country. And there is an enormous level of naivety um, that unfortunately kind of colors their understanding. Um, and then I think they suffer from the same problem that they, there is one simple thing with Russia. Don't think logically. There is no logic. I mean, we from the Soviet period have these kind of basic things, right? There is no logic. So don't think logically, because then you are completely lost. Secondly, don't trust people that love Russia and have only positive feelings. Russia, you need to love and hate at the same time. You know, it's and Russians have the same, right? They love their country, but they hate it at the same time. There is no nation that is so self-critical as the Russians themselves. The only problem is that you, as an outsider, never should start to be critical, because then they immediately defend. But when they start, then you can join. And so there are all these kind of basic rules that you need to know before you understand what is actually happening. And then it's a country, it cannot get crazy enough. I mean, there's always more. It's always crazier than you can imagine. And so a lot of people, especially young journalists, they just look at you as if you are, you've lost your mind. You're just exaggerating. But this is Russia, right? And that makes it very difficult.
Sure. So, as someone who works in the field of higher education, how do you see the impact of recent events on academia in Russia?
For me, this is a very actually painful situation, because I have a lot of friends in Russia, a lot of people I love, but I also have a lot of Ukrainian friends, and some of them are at the front, They're in the Terabarona, they're in the army, or they are volunteers. And emotionally, I'm completely supportive of Ukraine. I'm doing everything possible 24/7 to help them. And I know that some of my Ukrainian friends or some of my Russian friends have not lost this imperial thought. So they actually do think that Ukraine is actually Nasha. And so I cannot, I don't want to have any communication with, because I don't want to wind up in a situation where I lose them as friends. Better not know and not talk than lose them. And so I think the only thing that really helps to bring this to an end is to isolate the country, to make people, to activate them to stand up to this, because they have to do it. It's their country, it's their government. But at the same time, I, of course, feel very sorry for their isolation, because I understand what the consequences are. For me, one thing that is kind of painful to watch is if I look at the number of Russians that have joined the Ukrainians in their fight against Putin, it's very small numbers. In the Second World War, you had this ROA, the Русская освободительная армия. Now you have small groups, like 5, 6 of them. There are many more Belarusians fighting on the Ukrainian side than Russia. And for me, that's painful, because they need to be there. Ukraine deserves that support, because actually what Ukraine is now doing is helping to end the Putin regime and bring back the possibility of a democratization in Russia. And they deserve all the support they need.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I'd like to touch on your professional interests in forensic psychiatry. In particular, the punitive psychiatry as practiced in the Soviet Union. According to some, there are signs that psychiatry is continuing to be abused in Putin's Russia. Do you think that's the case?
Oh, yes. And increasingly. It's a bit different. In Soviet times, it was Andropov who developed this, actually. It was a very systematic system of getting rid of dissidents via the psychiatric route. And our organization kind of calculated that probably 1 out of 3 wound up in psychiatric hospital, but I found documents in the Stasi archive, KGB documents, that was talking about 50% being mentally ill. Now it's more individual cases. The diagnosis is different. It's not sluggish schizophrenia, but it's now personality disorder. And I think it's mainly because Russian psychiatry never recovered from the Soviet period. In principle, the same gang is still in charge of psychiatry, but it's their students and their kids. And so it's the atmosphere in the country that allows them to use psychiatry. It's a very easy way. You put them, you threaten. In most cases, it's enough to threaten people that, if you continue, we'll send you to the psychiatric hospital. And it's what Andropov used to call prophylactizировать, right? He had these yearly reports that in this and this year, мы профилактизировали 67,000, people. And it works. And now, but I see the numbers going up, in particular Crimea again. And very often it's personality disorders with the same symptoms as sluggish schizophrenia. But it's not a system yet.
Mm-hmm. And coming to my final question, we've talked about the war. All wars come to an end. And how do you think this war will end? And more broadly, how do you see the future for human rights in Russia?
I hope that the war will end with an end to the current regime in Russia. But as I said, I think the only way to end this permanently is a disintegration of Russia. I see Russia now as a kind of continuation of the Soviet Union, just on a smaller scale.
Mhm.
And so what we thought would happen in the end of the, well, at the beginning of the 90s and never happened, needs to happen now. After that, I think we will go through a very long process or a repetition in a way of what started in with perestroika and glasnost in 87, 88. But then we are much further back. We lost not only this whole period, but we went further back into history. In a way, we need to start with 56, the speech of Khrushchev, you know, the de-Stalinization. And this is for, you know, I'm not the youngest anymore. I would love to see Russia as a country based on the rule of law with at least a certain level of human rights, you know, guaranteed. I know a lot of former Sovietologists who are older than me, who are completely disenchanted. They gave up, you know, they put their whole life into this and it's lost. It's, you know, down the sewage, basically. And I still hope that I might see that day. You know, I was always the young kid on the block, so I, I have a small benefit. I'm not young anymore, but then I was very young. So it's going to be generations, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you for that analysis and for participating today in Rights in Russia.
You're most welcome.
I wish you all the best in your scholarly work and your work with young people, which I think is very encouraging. And we look forward to seeing you again on Rights in Russia. Robert,
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk. Have a good day. Okay.